Look at this stump, just look at it. A man is standing next to it in this picture, full-grown, arms stretched wide, and he barely reaches halfway across. This isn't a boulder, this isn't a rock formation, this was a tree. And where this one stood, there were millions more just like it. Before you took your first breath on this earth, before your parents did, before anyone alive today can claim to remember. The greatest trees this planet ever produced were taken down. Chain by chain, blade by blade, hillside by hillside. And what is wild, what is genuinely unsettling, is that almost nobody brings it up. But here is the part that will stay with you. They didn't vanish completely. What those trees left behind is still out there, sitting in the soil, waiting to be recognized for what it actually is. Close your eyes for a second and try to build this world in your head. You are standing somewhere along the Pacific coast, Northern California, maybe Oregon. The ocean is behind you. And in front of you, stretching as far as any direction you can look, is a forest unlike anything that exists in its full form today. Coast redwoods pushing past 300 feet straight up, higher than the Statue of Liberty from base to torch, higher than most buildings in most cities. And it isn't just one or two of them standing there as novelties, it is all of them, packed so tightly together that the canopy above you is essentially a ceiling, a living ceiling. And the light filtering down through it is green and slow and cathedral quiet. The ground beneath your feet is spongy with centuries of decomposed wood and moss. The air smells like something ancient. You can feel the scale of it in your chest before your brain fully registers what your eyes are telling you. These trees weren't saplings that grew fast. They had been standing in this exact soil for 2,000 years in some cases. The giant sequoias further inland were even older, even wider, trees so massive that their trunk bases could fit a small house inside them. Birds had evolved to live only in their upper canopy. Fish ran through the streams that wound around their roots. This wasn't simply a forest, it was an entire breathing, layered, interlocked world. And it had been running uninterrupted for longer than most human civilizations have existed. Then the 1800s arrived, and with them, hunger. Not hunger in the personal sense, hunger in the industrial sense. America was expanding at a pace that demanded material, and these forests were the most abundant source of raw wood on the continent. The railroads needed lumber for their ties. The mines needed timber to brace their tunnels. The cities going up across the west needed planks, beams, boards in quantities that seemed almost impossible to supply. And here stood the answer. Millions of acres of the densest, tallest, most voluminous timber on Earth. The first crews came in with hand axes and long cross-cut saws, and they worked in teams, spending full days on a single trunk. And then the technology evolved. Steam-powered equipment arrived, donkey engines and cable systems that could drag an entire felled giant down a hillside in hours. What started as hard, slow labor became something approaching a mechanical process. Systematic, scalable, relentless. The pace of the cut accelerated year after year, decade after decade, and the forests that had stood for millennia began retreating like a tide going out. What had taken nature thousands of years to assemble was being disassembled at a speed nature had never experienced before. What stood for thousands of years began to fall in minutes. Imagine being there when one of them came down. The sawyers would work through a trunk that might be 15 or 20 feet across, and the process itself could take an entire day. Wedging the cut open to keep it from pinching the blade, reading the tree for which way it would lean, stepping back again and again to reassess. And then the moment would come. A crack, first, sharp and explosive, something you'd feel in your teeth before you heard it with your ears. Then the slow beginning of the fall, almost gentle at first, the crown beginning its arc through the air, picking up speed with every foot it dropped, and then the impact, a concussion through the ground that sent birds into the air half a mile away, and left every man on that hillside standing still for a moment with his hat in his hands. The tree that had been alive since before anyone's great-great-grandfather was born was now a log. And the forest around it, that green cathedral effect, the hush, the filtered light, the sense of being inside something larger than yourself, was suddenly broken open to raw sky. Workers described something like reverence in those moments, even as they moved on to the next mark. The weight of what they were doing was not lost on them, it simply wasn't enough to stop them. Here is the number. Over 95% of the original old-growth redwood forest is gone. Gone, not thinned, not reduced, gone. In 1850, there were somewhere close to 2 million acres of it running along the California coast. By the time the cutting finally slowed, less than 5% of that remained in anything close to its original condition. And the giant sequoias, those inland giants whose wood turned out to be too brittle to even mill properly, which shattered when they hit the ground, were cut anyway. For curiosity, for photographs, for the sheer spectacle of proving it could be done. Tunnels were carved through living trunks wide enough for carriages to pass through, and people posed in them for pictures. And all of this, all of it, happened inside of 60 years. 6 decades. 1 human lifetime. A system that nature had been building and refining and layering for thousands upon thousands of years was reduced to stumps and slash piles within a time frame your own great-great-grandparents lived through. A forest that took thousands of years to grow was erased within a single lifetime. That is not a statistic. That is something that should physically change the way you sit in your chair right now. And when you start to understand the full picture of what was inside those forests, not just the trees themselves, but everything the trees made possible, the loss deepens further still. These ecosystems were storing carbon on a scale that modern science is still trying to fully quantify. A single ancient redwood holds more carbon in its trunk than entire stands of younger trees because of the sheer mass it accumulates over centuries. When those trees were cut and burned, when the slash, the branches, the tops, the material too small to mill was set on fire to clear the land, that carbon went into the atmosphere. The biodiversity that depended on the old growth structure vanished with it. There are bird species that nest specifically in the wide horizontal limbs of trees that are at least 500 years old. They cannot use younger growth because the branches aren't wide enough, aren't stable enough, haven't been there long enough. There are fungi that live only in the soil of these ancient groves, fungi that the trees themselves depended on to process nutrients through their roots. Take the trees and you take the fungi. Take the fungi and you destabilize the soil. Take the soil stability and you lose the streams, the watershed, the salmon runs that fed everything downstream. We didn't just cut trees, we pulled out the keystone of an entire living system, and everything that had been resting on it came down too. But here is what I keep coming back to. They left the stumps, drive out into Humboldt County in Northern California, and they are still there, enormous, flat-topped, gray from over a century of coastal weather, wide enough that you could park several cars on top of one and have room to spare. People go out and stand on them, take photos on them, kids play on them, and there is something almost unbearable about that image if you sit with it long enough. The fact that what remains of a 2,000-year-old living thing is now a picnic platform. But look at it from another angle. Look at those stumps as what they actually are. They are monuments. Not the kind anyone built on purpose, not the kind anyone voted to erect or debated over or dedicated with a speech. They are monuments in the oldest sense of the word, physical remains that force the present to reckon with the past. They say, without any words at all, something was here, something enormous was here, and it is gone now. In another world, a world without the records we have, without the photographs, without the science, what would someone looking at a moss-covered, weathered, 15-foot-wide circular formation in the middle of a forest even think it was? It might not look like a stump at all. It might look like something geological, like a natural formation, like a feature of the landscape that had always been there. Which brings up something worth sitting with. What do you actually see when you look at a landscape? Because most of us, without realizing it, see what is there and assume it reflects what has always been there. A hillside covered in 60-year-old second-growth trees reads as a forest. It has the shapes of a forest, the sounds, the smell. It does not read as a wound. A wide gray circle on the forest floor reads as a natural feature. It does not read as the footprint of something that once reached 300 feet into the sky. Ecologists have a name for this problem: shifting baseline syndrome. Each generation inherits a version of the world and treats that version as the default, the original, the normal. Whatever was lost before they arrived doesn't register as a loss because they never knew it existed. So the question this forces is a serious one. If we are this poor at recognizing what is missing, if a landscape can lose 95% of its most defining feature and within 2 generations simply appear normal, what else have we been looking at without actually seeing? Part of what keeps this history quiet is that it was never framed as a tragedy in its own time. It was framed as progress. The timber barons of the late 1800s were not hidden figures, they were celebrated ones. Their names went on buildings, their portraits hung in offices. The logging camps were seen as evidence of American industry and resolve, proof that a civilization could take a wilderness and convert it into something useful. The workers themselves were heroes of labor in the popular imagination. There was no cultural vocabulary yet for what was being lost. No framework that would have let people in 1880 look at a cleared hillside and call it a catastrophe. And by the time that vocabulary existed, by the time the environmental movement had developed the language and the science to describe what old-growth destruction actually meant, almost all of it was already gone. There were no elders left who remembered the unbroken forest stretching from horizon to horizon. There were photographs, there were stumps, and there was silence where the living knowledge of it used to be. It was gone before anyone had fully understood what it was. So can it come back? Honestly, not in any form that would be recognizable as what was lost, not within any time frame that matters to the people alive today or their children or their grandchildren. Trees can be planted. Redwoods do regenerate. There are protected groves in Northern California where old-growth trees still stand, where the original ecosystem is still partially intact, and they are extraordinary. There are also younger forests nearby that are slowly developing some of the structural characteristics of old growth. Bigger canopy, more complexity, the early signs of ecological layering. That matters. That is worth protecting and encouraging. But a forest that was 2,000 years in the making cannot be rebuilt in a century. The species that depended on specific old growth conditions cannot just adapt to younger trees. The carbon stored over millennia cannot be resequestered in decades. We can plant trees, we can protect what survived, but we cannot undo what was done, not really. The honest version of this story does not end with restoration. It ends with responsibility, with understanding clearly what was lost so we can at least stop pretending the loss didn't happen. Here is what strikes me most about those stumps. They are still wider than almost anything around them. The trees that have grown up in the decades since the logging, the second-growth redwoods, some of them now 60 or 80 years old and impressive in their own right, are nowhere near the diameter of the stumps they stand beside. The stump is still the biggest thing in the area. Still, after all this time, that is how large the originals were. And when you stand next to one and put your hands on the cut surface and feel the rings under your palms, compressed, fine, each one representing a year of growth, hundreds of them before you've crossed 6 inches of wood. Something becomes true in a way it wasn't before. This was alive, this was here. This was part of something we have no full equivalent for anymore. The tallest trees on Earth didn't fall in a storm. They didn't succumb to disease or age. They were removed, deliberately, commercially, systematically removed, and then the world moved on and forgot to mark the occasion. So I want to leave you with the one question this whole story keeps pointing back to. If something this vast, this ancient, this alive, this irreplaceable, could be almost entirely erased inside a single human lifetime, and if that erasure could then fade so completely from collective memory that the landscape left behind simply started to read as normal, what else is missing that we don't know to look for? What else are we standing inside of right now, treating as background, that is actually the remnant of something we've already lost? The stumps are still out there, the records are still out there, the science is still out there. We just have to be willing to look at what they're actually showing us. Drop a comment with what hit you hardest in this. And if you think stories like this one deserve to be told, you already know what to do.